Well, Rob, always.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're joining us today in Canada. Welcome to the 2022 Paul and Eileen Lynn Commemorative Lecture. This year titled The Battle for Chinatowns Across Canada. My name is Rob Ho, and I'm the president of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society of British Columbia. On behalf of our board of directors, we are pleased to partner with the University of British Columbia's Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program, Simon Fraser University's Global Asia program, and the City program at SFU Continuing Studies to bring you this event. I'm honored to be speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Lekwungen speaking people, including the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, colonially known as Victoria. Please take a moment to reflect on the land from which you are joining us today. For those of you not aware of our society, CCHSBC is a nonprofit, participatory provincial organization dedicated to broadening our shared understanding of the history of the Chinese in British Columbia through research, documentation, preservation, and education. I wanted to share a few words about the Paul and Eileen Lynn Commemorative Lecture and its history. Born in Vancouver, Paul Lynn was the founding director of the Center for East Asian Studies at McGill University, and also where Eileen received her master's degree in library science in 1969. In 1981, Paul was appointed the rector at the University of Macau, and together they founded the Soon Ching Ling Children's Foundation of Canada. Paul later became an honorary professor at UBC, and in 1998 received the Order of Canada. In 2004, Paul unfortunately passed away, but both Paul and Eileen have devoted their lives to reestablishing diplomatic relations between Canada and China, enhancing international friendship, and promoting social justice. In 2016, the Paul and Eileen Lynn Commemorative Fund was established to sponsor the annual Lynn Lecture on historical topics related to China-Canada relations or Chinese-Canadian history. Please consider donating if you're able to continue to bring in outstanding speakers and activists like the ones you'll hear today. You can contribute directly through our website, cchsbc.ca. Thank you. Our panel today, The Battle for Chinatowns Across Canada, is aptly named for the continuing challenge to preserve, maintain, and enhance Canadian Chinatowns. Of course, battles for Chinatown is not a new concept. The struggle for these spaces has been transpiring for generations since Chinese migration to Canada began, and these ethnic enclaves became vital and often the only areas for them to live and work. We're delighted to have speakers today represent 4 of the largest cities in Canada: Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal. Before I hand things over to our moderator, just a reminder to please mute yourselves, and if you have any questions you'd like to ask the panelists, please put them in the chat box. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Our moderator today is Mr. John Atkin, CCHSBC's Vice President and a civic historian and author who conducts many walking tours around Vancouver and the province. His tours offer interesting and offbeat insight to the city's architecture, history, and neighborhoods. John's publications include Heritage Walks Around Vancouver, Strathcona, Vancouver's First Neighborhood, Vancouver Walks, SkyTrain Explorer, and Changing City. He co-founded and served as vice president and president of Heritage Vancouver Society, and Atkin has been a CCHS board member since 2012 and has served as co-chair, president, and co-vice president. Over to you, John.
Oh, well, thank you very much. This whole session came about just in terms of our normal process at the CCHS, which is, what are we going to do for the Lynn Lecture? And throughout a number of different ideas, but the one that kept coming back was, of course, the continued struggle for Chinatowns that we've been witnessing both here in Vancouver and in the news elsewhere. And I think highlighted for us too was a lot of the reports that we saw throughout the pandemic in terms of overt racism aimed at Chinese and Chinatowns. And then coming out of the pandemic, we have a whole raft of new and continuing issues as well. And so this is where we were looking at sort of a different format for the Lynn Lecture, and also, I think, different perspectives. And I think that was one of the key pieces here, is that we're very wrapped up in what's happening in Vancouver's Chinatown, but our issues are similar and probably different from some of the other communities across the country. And so that's where we wanted the different perspectives. And so that's what we're doing today. And I'm really pleased with the folks that we have to present to you. So in the order that's on your screen, we're going to, I'll introduce everybody all at once, but then we'll start with Fred, then Teresa, then Shiwi, and then May. And so presentation and then some discussion. And then if we have some time at the end, we'll have a few questions which Joyce will be monitoring in the chat. So if you do have something you want to express or have answered, put it in the chat and we'll see if we can get to it. So with that, let me introduce who is on our panel today. We start with Fred Ma, and I was joking at the beginning that the legendary Fred Ma, but in many ways, Fred's legendary. And coming up on December 1st, the adding to his incredibly long list of honors and achievements, he's receiving the Order of British Columbia on December 1st, which is quite an honor. But for the past 6 decades, Ma has been a respected BC leader through advocacy for water quality, anti-racism, heritage conservation, cultural celebration, community building, international trade, cultural exchange. And he's been a huge volunteer with initiatives that have had provincial, national, and international impact. His list of different community organizations and trade delegations, et cetera, is extensive, but a couple of the key ones, he's been involved with the Vancouver Guangzhou Friendship Society, the Chinese Cultural Center of Greater Vancouver, the International Dragon Boat Festival Society, our own society, the Friends of False Creek, and his most recent and I think most impactful sort of involvement at the moment is the Chinatown Society Heritage Buildings Association, which is raising awareness of the unique society owned buildings within Vancouver's Chinatown. And he's chaired numerous boards and organizations, but he helped build memorial statues at Memorial Square, the Shanghai Alley projects, as well as the Housing Committee of the Chinese Benevolent Association, Chinatown Visioning Committee, and the Centennial Commission, Chinese Canadian Museum, Chinatown Legacy Stewardship Committee. And Chinatown is a National Historic Site because of Fred's advocacy for the idea that Vancouver's Chinatown might be and should be on UNESCO's World Heritage List. And so I was very pleased and honored to be able to work with Fred and a committee on writing that application, which had our Chinatown recognized as a National Historic Area. And so some of his honors is receiving the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012, the City of Vancouver Civic Merit Award in 2013, and that same year, our society honored Fred. We do an honoree every year, and we have honored Fred in 2013, and his Order of BC is coming up December 1st. So with that rather extensive introduction, that is Fred Ma. And joining us from Calgary, we have the Honorable Teresa Wu Pa. And Wu Pa is a tireless advocate for diversity, social inclusion, active civic participation for over 45 years. She's known for her ability in bringing diverse people together into joint efforts, break new grounds, and create bigger impacts in society. And she is the first Canadian woman of Asian descent elected to the Calgary Board of Education. That was between 1995 and 2000, and the Alberta Legislature and the Cabinet Minister between 2008 and 2015. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in social work from the University of Calgary. She founded and built 8 nonprofit entities over a span of 44 years, including the Action Dignity, the Ethnocultural Council of Calgary, Diverse Cities, that's the Calgary Chinese Community Service Association, and she's worked with almost 100 organizations in Canada. And she's received the governor and council appointment and is chair of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation since 2018, founder and chair of the ACT, ACCT Foundation, and created the Inspire to Lead Chinese Canadian Leaders Summit and Aspire to Act Leadership Training Program. And she's also been involved in a lot of anti-Asian racism initiatives. She created the Asian Canadians Together, Act to End Racism Network, and she's the founder and current co-chair of the Asian Heritage Foundation and a board member of the Calgary Arts Foundation. And so that's Teresa joining us from Calgary. And we have Chi-Yi Tam from Toronto. Tam is an urban planner, anti-gentrification organizer, raised in Vancouver on the unceded Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, and is in translation between places and culture. She is currently the executive director of the Kensington Market Community Land Trust. She also organizes the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust, which is also exploring community ownership as an anti-displacement strategy for racial and economic justice in Toronto's Chinatowns. And she frequently consults with groups regarding social enterprise legislation, governance, cooperative strategies, and she aims to reciprocate knowledge into the community. And our last panelist is from Montreal, Mei Chi, and she is a family lawyer, community activist, and co-coordinator of the most recent Chinatown Roundtable in Montreal. Her past work has included the Head Tax Campaign, climate justice, and in solidarity with anti-Black racism. She was a member of the Extinction Rebellion. The Chinatown Roundtable is a multi-sectoral community board that is designed to be a liaison between various levels of government and community, share the information among different community sectors, and help build consensus around issues facing Montreal's Chinatown. And she continues to work on the preservation of Montreal's Chinatown. So that is our panel today. It's an extraordinary panel, I think, of really great experience and expertise. So I'm looking forward to both the presentations and the discussion. So we'll go in the order of west to east. And so we'll ask Fred to begin. Fred?
Thank you, John, for these kind words of introduction. To begin with, I would like to thank CCHS, Simon Fraser University, and UBC for organizing this lecture. Now, what happens is I'm going to be, brave and bold and say that Vancouver's Chinatown is not only the crown jewel of Vancouver, but the whole of Canada. In fact, we have the best Chinatown in North America. In Chinatown, the surrounding areas of Strathcona and downtown East Side, we have about 70 community organizations. Most of these organizations own their own building. Many of these buildings are more than 100 years old, with a unique architecture of Cantonese and European style. Some of the buildings have been designated as heritage. The federal government approved part of Chinatown as a National Historic Site. Before the pandemic, their organizations were buzzing with activities such as Tai Chi, Chinese dances, Chinese instrumental music, Cantonese opera, ping pong, and regional folk song, such as Hakka San Go, Tai San Mai Gai Diu, Qiu Zhou Yam Mo. They carry out traditional practices, such as remembering our forefathers at Qingming. We have the annual Chinese New Year parade. And recently, we have started the Fire Dragon Festival. That is actually the Autumn Festival. In addition, we have the Chinese Cultural Center, the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Garden, with these intangible and tangible cultural assets, we were able to convince the provincial government to support the city's submission for the application of UNESCO World Heritage Site for Chinatown. As a first step to support this application, the province provided partial funding for the development of the first Chinese Canadian museum in Canada. This museum will be in the heart of Chinatown, across the street from the Chinese Cultural Center. It will be officially open in July of next year. Before the year 2000, businesses were booming in every sector of the economy in Chinatown. During the barbecue meat fight with Health Canada, we estimated Chinatown merchants bought more than 50 pigs every week. Today, businesses experience a dramatic downturn. What causes this decline? First, it was older professionals, such as doctors, lawyers, and dentists, retiring, and no one wants to take over their business. Then there's a strong competition from Richmond and other areas with a high concentration of Chinese, as well as a competition from big chains such as T&T Market and Costco, located next to Chinatown. Most recently, the leakage of downtown East Side problems into Chinatown, causing safety and security concerns. During the last 2 years, all the community organizations have shut their doors due to COVID restrictions. Anti-Asian sentiment created by Trump's rhetoric about the Chinese virus runs high. Vancouver was described as the anti-Asian capital of North America. Asians are being attacked all over town, particularly in Chinatown. Can I have the slides? Yes, okay, thank you very much. Now, the first slide here on the left is showing the gate entering the Chinese classical garden. What happens, originally there was no gate there. And we put the gate there is because the people goes inside and sleep there and urinate and defecate in there. In the next slide, inside, you can see the graffiti that's on there at the Chinese Cultural Center, okay? And the next slide shows the windows on the ground floor. That's right, and at one time, most of these windows were broken. The next slide, please. Okay, this shows the front gate entering the courtyard. You can enter the courtyard from the garden side and in the Chinese Cultural Center. At the left, the line sitting there, you can see some blue. Actually, that blue was graffiti that was put on there. And what happens is that we tried to remove it, and it was not completely removed. Next slide, please. Now, this slide shows more graffiti. And on the right side down the bottom is a homeless person taking drugs. That's right in front of the Chinese culture, right at the corner. Next slide, please. Now, these three actually shows the graffiti is in Chinatown. I just took these last week. And on the slide on the right shows a store that's still operating. What they did is that they painted over this store's name. Next, please. Now, this slide in particular shows, a person running and kicking the mother and child. And that was on Pender Street, the main street on Chinatown. Next, please. This shows the homeless people and the people gathering on Main Street, which is right perpendicular to Pender Street, the main street on in Chinatown. Next, please. Next 3 slides shows the homelessness camps right next, well, when I say right next door is Hastings, and also the streets that Gore, and also and so on and so forth. Next, please. If there
That's all your
Okay.
slides, Fred.
Okay, thank you. The problems we face are numerous. Problems include fierce competition, anti-Asian racism, enticing professionals to set up offices, safety and security, homelessness, mental health, drug addiction, and graffitis. In spite of all these problems, certain businesses are still thriving. For example, Pizza Tanto, a fusion restaurant, just received a Michelin star award. And there's always a lineup at the entrance of Phnom Penh. At present, the city and the provinces is trying to educate people about racism, especially anti-Asian racism. A few years ago, city conducted study on the economic revitalization of Chinatown. A plan was for the revitalization was proposed with an implementation strategy. All we need to do is to take this report off the shelf and update it a bit and implement the recommendations and deal with the competition and attract young professionals into Chinatown. We are fortunate that we have a new mayor and council. For the short term, council has already committed funding to hire 100 new police officers and additional dollars for graffiti removal and street cleaning. We're hopeful that we will get foot patrol officers in Chinatown and get part of the funding for graffiti removal and street cleaning. We also have a new premier, David Eby. He came out of downtown East Side. He knows the downtown East Side problems intimately. For the long term, he knows we need the 3 levels of government to work together. In the first week, he already announced that he will take the lead to get the 3 levels of government committed to resolve the problems of safety and security, homelessness, mental health, and drug addiction. Our mayor, Ken Sim, is on side. The premier has already asked the prosecution service to take a look at the present day problems of repeated offenders that are arrested one day and released the next day to commit more crime. He announced that he will work with the cities to provide more social and low-cost housing. During his campaign to lead the province, he stated that we need to take a look at the mental health problem. Perhaps have modern day institutions for those patients that are difficult to treat. He said he has already stated that the federal government should be involved in resolving the drug problems. The repeated overdose individuals should be forced into a treatment program. I feel that for the long term, we must have a drug prevention program as well. Vancouver Chinatown is changing. We have second and third generation Chinese Canadians coming back as volunteers and open businesses in Chinatown. Chinese Benevolent Association, for the first time, elected a woman as the chair. I'm an eternal optimist. There is always a light at the end of the tunnel. We are a resilient bunch of people. Vancouver Chinatown will survive and thrive again with the UNESCO designation as a World Heritage Site. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. It's yes, talking about Chinatown, it's both positive and unfortunately we do have some negatives with the community, and yet over its very long history, it remains, and it's changing, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years. So then we move off over the mountains and to Calgary. Teresa, what's happening with your Chinatown?
Well, thank you very much, John. I'm joining everyone here today from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I want to thank you to the organizers for your kind invitation to include me in today's event on a topic I'm very passionate about and have worked extensively on for about 10 years and on and off since the late 1990s. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences and observations on efforts to preserve and revitalize Calgary's Chinatown, along with my colleagues from other cities. I think before I respond to the 3 questions posted to us to frame our presentation today, I think a little bit of my personal context, so you know the lens that shape my comments today. So in addition to my social work background, I spent over 40 years in community development and community building efforts, in part through building 8 organizations, but through which I saw firsthand the challenges, mistreatments, and barriers Chinese Canadians, racialized Canadians experience. I personally experienced and witnessed the underrepresentation, but more importantly, the impacts of underrepresentation in our public entities and organizations through my 12 years in public office, involvement in civil society organizations. The omissions, the persistent inequitable access to resources, support and opportunities perpetuating the systemic inequities and structural racial discrimination that are also contributing factors to the demise and challenges confronting Chinese Canadian communities and Chinatowns today. So first, Chinatown in the context of in the city of Calgary. So I debated whether I'm going to spend my limited time to talk about, a picture of Calgary's Chinatown, or just focus on what's happening today. But at the end, I chose to give an overview. So hopefully that will be helpful. So Chinatown in Calgary existed before Calgary officially became a city in 1894. So the current Calgary Chinatown location is the third in the city. The first Chinatown was formed around 1885. A majority of Calgary's earliest Chinese immigrants were railroad workers on the Canadian Pacific Railway in British Columbia. So the Great Fire destroyed half of the first Chinatown in 1886, and a mob tried to run the Chinese residents out of town in 1892 when they were accused of spreading the smallpox. Chinese Canadians endure hardships of discrimination, racism, including the federal head tax enacted in 1885, but the Chinese population in Calgary continued to grow, and a second Chinatown emerged. As described in the Calgary Chinatown Cultural Plan recently, around 1910, the Canadian Northern Railroad announced its plan to develop this area, the second Chinatown. So landlords evicted the Chinese residents and sold their properties for profits, displacing Chinatown once more. So this might have been the end of Calgary's second Chinatown, had several wealthy Chinese merchants not intervened and bought land for the third Chinatown site. So the third Chinatown was established trying to show. So the third Chinatown was established in 1910, and the community leaders. Okay, I'm going to stop. So the Chinese, the community lead has negotiated with city official for a new location while facing fierce resistance from local groups. Some of the leaders were elected officials at the time. Chinese Canadian businessmen strategically bought a property at the corner of Center Street that I just shown, and then 2nd Avenue Southeast to build the Canton block. These became the cornerstone of what we know today as Calgary Chinatown. So similar to Chinatowns in the rest of the country, one of the foundations of Chinatown is the merchants, the businesses, and working class immigrants that work hard to establish a vital and sustainable community. It is here that despite continued anti-Chinese sentiments and government measures, a resilient community have been able to survive and thrive. By 1921, Calgary's Chinese population had grown to about 700 people and began to decline following the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923 and the Great Depression. So following the repeal of the act in 1947, the number of Chinese in Calgary began to rise again. As Chinese residents start to move into areas outside Chinatown, along with its declining numbers, Calgary's Chinatown had become dilapidated over the years, making it an easy target for demolition. So in 1966, city planners proposed a superhighway and a new Center Street Bridge in the area, both of which would have destroyed Chinatown. So the Sandlock Society of Calgary organized a national conference on urban renewals as it affects Chinatown in 1969, the first conference of its kind in North America, garnered public attention and media pressure that led to the city's decision to abandon the proposal and ended up upgrading the area. So Calgary's Chinatown continued to face threats in the 70s and 80s, and in 73, the construction of the federal government complex forced the relocation of 200 Chinatown residents. That year, the Bow Trail extension was revived and was only defeated due to the unyielding efforts of the Chinese community. A review of the city's Chinatown area redevelopment plan in the 80s, you will see the municipality's predominant perception of Chinatown is just as part of downtown. Huge omission of its historical significance was very evident. In the early 80s, several developers wanted to construct extremely high density buildings, which would destroy the character of Calgary's Chinatown. The community once again joined forces to save Chinatown. In 1983, the Chinatown Development Committee, comprised of community and interested corporate members, reached agreement to allow developers to increase building density and land reclassification, while allotting land and funding to the community to start the building of the Chinese Cultural Center. Then in 2016, the city attempted to make changes to the land use policy for a developer to build 3 27-story high towers in Chinatown without proper communication information, without consultation, let alone culturally appropriate consultation, until strong pressure from the community groups. Without social or environmental impact studies, without adhering to established policies on culturally appropriate practices, the community organized, raised awareness, demanding meetings and consultation, protested and rallied, including foregoing the celebration of the first day of Chinese New Year to attend a meeting at City Hall about Chinatown. So despite the efforts, the community lost that battle. So Calgary's Chinatown, like many others in Canada and North America, has gone through stages of relocations, development, dispossessing by urbanization and gentrification, endured institutional disrespect and neglect. Calgary is one of those that managed to survive and now in need of renewal and revitalization. So in 2019, the city embarked on the development of a cultural plan for Chinatown, along with the updating, modernizing of the area redevelopment plan with an advisory committee. The trust and relationship between the municipality and the Chinese community has since much improved. The Chinatown cultural plan and area development plan will be going to City Council for final approval very soon. Indicators are looking very promising. So the revitalization hopefully will begin soon. I think there's some small areas where we have already started. You can find more information about this new stage of work from the City of Calgary website, because I just don't have time to actually go into that at that area. So, and then I would talk a little bit about the current issues impacting the Calgary community. So like what Fred had alluded to, issues of inclusion and safety, impacts of the COVID-triggered racism, scapegoating, rise of hate and discrimination, hate incidents and crimes, diminished sense of safety and heightened insecurity for people of all ages, but especially our seniors in the Chinatown area, the economic impacts from the pandemic, and the need for resources for economic revitalization, cultural heritage preservation, addressing and finding sustainable solutions to the social issues like homelessness, drugs, all those issues. But what I would like to emphasize a little bit here today is some of the underlying challenges. I would say systemic challenges that have been facing our community. One is the inequitable access to resources. It have been confirmed, I think in part due to race-based data, that the Asian Canadian communities under access public funding, public resources in terms of funding and also programming. And so the impact of the inequitable access to resources is have led to the lack of or inadequate community capacity to address issues of importance and concern to the community. So in order for the Chinese Canadian community and Chinatown communities to adequately, meaningfully participate in civic leadership, meaningful civic engagement to make improvements to meet community needs and contribute to the public good, we need capacity. We need to develop and possess the abilities to come together with democratic practice, knowledge, and skills. The ability to identify and assess the issues facing the community, identify and be able to access resources, be it knowledge, research, information, develop strategies and propose solutions, financial support, skill building, governance, managing people and issues, and also intersect with and engage relevant sectors, work with communities across culture and generations, engage with public entities, decision makers, the media, the community, and the public. We need capacity for collective and collaborative actions. We need to more strategically build relationship with institutions. And we also need resources and skills to really enhance our ability to raise public awareness and support. Because I think what we are working towards is also institutional change for long-term sustainable preservation and sustained revitalization of Chinatowns. And studies and research on social change to address diversity and inclusion, point to the fundamental importance of possessing organizational capacity as the cornerstone for change. Not that we don't have the capacity, we have been systematically left out of the learnings and capacity building resources and programs. So, we need to really work collectively to address this inequity to resources, and the other is raising our ability to engage the public, because as a racial minority, gaining public support is key for institutional change, for addressing the inequities that we face, and to sustain revitalization effort of Chinatown. So lastly, my approach to some of these issues, I'm going to focus on three. One is resistance, community organizing and mobilizing when required. So I was involved in community organizing in the 80s, in the 90s, in 2016, helping to form the Saving Chinatown Task Force in 2016. And as the chair of the ACT Foundation, organized national roundtables during our Chinese-Canadian Leaders Summit since 2019. Supported a call to action initiated by the Center for Research and Race Relations in Montreal, calling for a national plan to build back better Canada's Chinatowns. Supported the campaign on saving Chinatown during the 2021 federal election. Supported, very sadly, the last chapter, the closure of the last building in Lethbridge, Chinatown. And second is engagement with institutions. So I decided, despite the difficulty, the challenges we encountered in 2016, I joined the Tomorrow's Chinatown Advisory Committee in 2018, 2019 until present time. And the other is to seek a systemic policy solution after losing the battle in 2016. So I started having a discussion with federal officials, with ministers, with MPs, raising issues at ministers' roundtables, talking to relevant ministries, senior officers, policymakers, and also included the issue of despairing Chinatown when I had a fireside chat with the Prime Minister during the 2021 Leaders Summit. And lastly is national coordination. I think that what we're all trying to do here, we have some common issues and concerns and shared goals here. We are all under-resourced. And so to me, as a social worker, it just makes sense to work collectively and collaboratively to address this issue of common concern. And also to really act on the belief in collective power and actions. And as Eric Liu, talks about power compounds. And so I also believe in strength in number. So the erosion and the erasure of the historically, socially, culturally significant spaces of the same ethnic group across North America is not isolated situation, is systemic. So making collective efforts just more compelling and I think makes sense for me. So the ACT Foundation convened and supported multi-region dialogues efforts, roundtables, 2019, 2021, and 2022. And recently, we initiated and supported the development of a brief that captured the needs and specific proposals from 12 Chinatowns from across the country, with the hope that this would be a useful tool for our collective effort to engage public institutions in the saving of Canada's Chinatown. So sorry, I did not time myself, did not look at the clock. Right. And so I hope that I spoke within the range of my allotted time. Thank you very much for everyone's attention.
Great, thank you so much. It is interesting how I think every Chinatown in Canada probably had an expressway planned to go right through it, and or other major developments. And you look back through the history, it's just a very consistent history of a considered marginal area, and just let's put it right through. And the other key thing that comes out of that, and I'm interested to know how the other two Chinatowns think about this, but the lack of capacity when cities, and especially Vancouver, announces, say, a new program, say a granting program, they do nothing to empower the community to actually access that. And when I've been working with one group on some grants, even I'm looking at the grant application going, holy, what's it? Like, how much time it would take and does take to fill out the basic form, and then thinking a clan association of seniors wanting to improve an SRO, a single room occupancy that they own, and trying to manage the granting side of it, let alone everything else. And we never seem to build capacity into any of those programs that are supposed to assist and help. And so I think it's nice to hear that, not nice, but it is good to hear that we're not the only ones that don't build the capacity within the programs that are supposed to help. Let's move on. Toronto and Chi Yi. I'm looking forward to hearing what's up in Toronto.
Happy to. I need Joyce's help here with my slides. If they could go up, that would be so thrilling and helpful. I love that Teresa kind of segued and bridged from Fred over to me. I think increasingly in the portion that I will speak to you for the next 15 minutes, you'll hear a lot more about the same waves of development trends, the lack of community consultation for development projects that are deeply harmful and displacing to Chinatown's core, both architecturally and in terms of people and their practices. Just assume that all of that is a shared history, very much so. So yeah. Thank you again for hosting this event and gathering us all across a range of really different local contexts and really different perspectives. I think I will be pushing us further to a radical perspective and hopefully offering a range and diversity for the audience to see the many different approaches that people are taking in fighting for Chinatown. So my name is Chi Yi Tam, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to give you an update on where the battle for Chinatowns is at in the downtown Toronto context. The lens through which I understand this history is primarily through the work of Friends of Chinatown Toronto. So please keep in mind that, you know, anyone who claims to be a total representative for their region you should be deeply suspicious of. And so in that way, there are many other community groups that are active across the Greater Toronto's various Chinatowns and Chinatown-like spaces, doing very different and interesting work, not just us. So to go to the next slide, of course, we open with that all our Chinatowns are on Indigenous land. And it might be interesting for some of you less familiar with the lands we're on, that the Greater Toronto area has multiple Chinatowns. And for reasons that will become clear later, all of them are in various forms on Anishinaabe land. So if you're familiar, the downtown or West Chinatown is centered at the intersection of Spadina and Dundas streets. Spadina, or the original Ojibwe Ishpadina, literally means the land the place where the land rises. So indeed, if you've ever tried to bike up the center of Chinatown on Spadina, it's a very gradual incline, almost an invisible hill. Next slide, please. So this is the place that Friends of Chinatown, or FOCT, organizes. This place is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit of the Anishinaabe, who are the traditional owners and protectors of this land most recently. But in addition to that, it's also been recognized as Wendat territory and the Honishinone's territory. So Chinatown community members through that are subject to what we call the dish with one spoon territory. This is an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee to peaceably share the land. The dish is Lake Ontario. The spoon is the responsibility that we all share. So we are a grassroots group, i.e. we are not incorporated. We do not take official forms of funding. And we're all immigrant settlers in our various different individual journeys to Chinatown, fighting for housing, economic, and racial justice in Chinatown. So I'll speak to that more in detail. So a lot of our work is on land and in response to development, i.e. colonization. And that has made immigration and living here possible through the exploitation of Black and Indigenous peoples in our neighborhood and in our city. And as we live and organize here, I think something that our organizers think about and reflect on very often is that other communities, specifically Indigenous communities and Black communities in Toronto, were violently robbed of their ability to do so in a way that we historically should really be able to understand in solidarity. So our ability now to more freely organize within our own communities is an incredible form of privilege and medicine and healing that is not afforded to all. So we are explicitly anti-police, we are explicitly anti-capitalist in support of other Black and Indigenous activists who have been paving the way. So what does that look like in Chinatown? Next slide. The catalyst for this group coming together starts in 2018 in response to the loss of, in response to three things. One is the Bright Pearl building being gentrified into this horrible gray art gallery that you see on the screen. Next slide. The second is the Toronto Police proposing surveillance cameras, public surveillance cameras in Chinatown's public spaces. And the next slide. The third is a specific development application going ahead on the address of 315 and 325 Spadina. So this is a condo project that was slated to replace an entire block of Chinatown. And since then, we've worked on a variety of different projects, which is likely where many of you might have heard of our work online, especially on Instagram, which we'll speak more about today, including Food Mutual Aid, including working to take land off of the real estate market through the Community Land Trust, and supporting other groups that are pushing for migrant workers' rights and sex workers' rights. Next slide, please. So let's go back through a couple of those catalytic events in more detail so that you understand the significance that situates the modern fight for Chinatown, as I like to say. Toronto's Chinatown was displaced wholesale, similarly to Calgary's multiple times in the 1960s. So the classic Chinatown strategy of creating these vaguely Asian-looking building facades as a way to make the neighborhood very palpable, very legible, as a sort of Disneyland for white people, was not a strategy that Toronto's Chinatown had access to the same degree. They did not express this to the same degree because of this relocation and the amount of capital investment that would have required from the community. So we don't have that kind of classic Chinatown looking building. And in that way, the Sun Guang Center, the Bright Pearl that you saw that was bright yellow and green, is, as we would call it, the Bright Pearl for shorthand, is one of the only ones that was on the major avenue of Spadina. And this made it really deeply iconic and therefore doubly symbolic when it became this gray box. So it also carries this incredible legacy before it became an explicitly Chinese Chinatown looking building. It was part of the working class legacy of Toronto. It was originally built as a union temple or a labor hall, as you would call it, by the Jewish laborers' unions. And the handover from one deeply community cultural use from the Jewish to the Chinese community is also deeply symbolic of the shift on Spadina Avenue specifically. So then imagine the fury, the slap in the face that it is for them to turn this truly universally agreed upon as ugly building with flashing lights to deter people from sleeping on the steps. And the disrespect of keeping only one of the food dogs at the entrance, unpairing them from each other. We cannot imagine the curse that they have put themselves on. And in the end, they never found a tenant for this building. That is the only kind of gratification we can draw from it. Next slide, please. So Friends of Chinatown formed in response to these big heartbreaks and in solidarity with a week of action from a group called Coast to Coast for Chinatowns Against Displacement that was convening. So we marched, we grew an anti-gentrification garden in Chinatown Center and began to scheme together. Next slide, please. In specific response to the 315, 325 Spadina development application, this application, the reason we were opposing it is because it was actually adding nothing to the neighborhood except for unaffordable rental units by way of displacing some deeply, what we call culturally competent retail services. And this has been a key phrase that we've tried to introduce into the Toronto urban planning sphere. There wasn't anything about this building, to make the point again, that wasn't already serving the community. So it's the home of Royal Sand Restaurant, very iconic, the dim sum house, of which the neon fish sign we have made our logo. And our childhood optometrists and dentists have offices here. And so Focht decided, there's enough artists in the group, to make a parody of the classic blue development notice that the city officials often post up against buildings as they are legally required to. And the result, next slide, was that this went incredibly viral. It drew huge crowds to the community consultation meetings. Next slide, please. It I would say that it catapulted Fox work into the mainstream conversation. We were on the CBC, we were getting a lot of mainstream coverage, and it forced the city of Toronto to, for the first time ever, you'll see those three blue signs there. I know that people from Vancouver will find this unbelievable, but for the first time ever in the city of Toronto in 2020, translated official development notices into another language, traditional and simplified Chinese, there next to the English. So we were at the negotiating table for community benefit agreements on this site for over a year, and in the end, this project was approved. So as much as every planner in the city will tell you that the concessions we received on this project were completely unprecedented and far, far higher than what is typically required, it's really hard for us to call this a win because mainstream development and planning standards for affordable housing provision in Toronto are so low that they are in hell. So we kind of refuse to celebrate this type of unfreedom, as it were. And we would like to do this like expansive imagination space. If we were to buy this building together as a community and intensify it ourselves, redevelop it ourselves, we would just add 100% affordable housing on top of the existing shops. Why would we make such a concession in exchange for a handful of not that affordable average market rents for only 40 years, right? So let's skip ahead to where we're at. Where does this leave our battle, our specific fight for Chinatown in Toronto? Sure, we have resolved ourselves to be anti-displacement and refuse to exhaust ourselves by only fighting all the time. And the reality is that this fight is you could call it a new wave of real estate speculation, inducing a housing crisis of a very different nature than the types of displacements that previous Chinatown organizers have taught us about and shared their histories with us about. It feels insidious. It feels insidious because of this very idea that land value fictitiously captures the social and cultural work that communities have put in to make a place what it is. And the real estate state says that you can sell this to someone to experience this culture that they did not create. Is that not true of every Chinatown you have ever experienced, or any other ethnic enclave where you have felt the loss of your food, the loss of the chefs and the community relationships that you have witnessed on a day-to-day basis, and and kind of this inexplicable fury that comes from seeing the new waves of people that are consuming your culture. So next slide. One strategy that we have learned a lot about is heritage, and it had a time and place and is incredibly important to stop the hemorrhaging. But what we have learned in Toronto over and over again is that heritage designations, the way they work here, which may be unique to the circumstances elsewhere, do not stop renovictions. And so in a way, when we try to inventory the amount of energy we spend fighting for Chinatown, we are slowly diverting our energy away from this strategy. It's still important, and it would be great if they would just automatically grant this to us. Governments should already know to do this for all of the Chinatowns, but we're not going to exhaust ourselves doing this. So then what do we do instead is the question. Next slide. I'm alluding to people handing down knowledge, but as other people have made this point before me, we have literally never not been fighting to save Chinatown, no matter what Chinatown you've been in from the very first existence of it, right? So here we have a particularly legible and really well-recorded history. That's Jean Lum in a car convertible going down the main avenue of Toronto's first Chinatown, which was wholesale demolished. I'll show you the photos in the next slide here. That's a glimpse of what first Chinatown looked like. And it wasn't that far from where we are organizing in West Chinatown now. Next slide. What were they trying to build? If you've learned that property ownership alone does not protect you from expropriations by the colonial government, this is the reason why. This is what they did with first Chinatown. They built this incredibly ugly City Hall building, which continues to be City Hall for Toronto today. The architectural form draws literally, I kid you not, I'm not making this up, the inspiration is the all-seeing eye of government. So if you looked at this building from the bird eye view, it's literally meant to look like an eye. Next slide. So at some point, you need to sustain your love for Chinatown with something that's reciprocal, an exchange of community care, and a feeling that you're actively building a future here. We've had many hard conversations with ourselves during COVID, during new waves of anti-Asian racism, whether we wanted to participate in the righteous and exhausting battles on all fronts, it felt like. In the end, next slide, please. We decided to make several key decisions. The first is that we refused to engage in charitable relationships with one another. We started shifting our approach to the classic food hamper, the vaccine clinics, the rights-based workshop content that did not also at the same time bring our community members and neighbors into a broader relationship with political struggle and organizing with each other in the long term. Next slide, please. I will say that we made many mistakes to get here. We hurt each other's feelings, but in the end, we have reflected very deeply on how to avoid the same mistakes in the future. And we decided that we are going to categorically stop taking any more government funding in cooperation, large or small. It just was compromising too much of our relationships with each other and the mutual aid work that we need to do. As you were just talking about, John, it also was just taking too much of our energy to navigate all of these weird criterias when we could just post an ask on Instagram and raise $50,000 the next day. So there wasn't a need for it. The second is that we decided that each of our projects were going to become vibrant committees on their own and balanced both reactive and proactive approaches to their areas of focus in Chinatown. How am I doing for time? Should I
You're
end?
fine.
You're
No,
fine? Okay, so
carry
next
on.
slide, please. So I'll wrap by telling you about the work of the committee that I am most active on, the Chinatown Land Trust. In 2020, we conducted our first preliminary study to explore whether there was a rationale for using a land trust approach as a way to address the displacement in Chinatown. Next slide, please. We quickly learned, so you can find the full report online, both on Fox Instagram account or on my website. And we quickly learned that there is nothing natural about gentrification itself. Anybody who goes down the rabbit hole could quickly find that Chinatown, as is outlined in red there, is perfectly in this pocket that does not have a secondary plan, a heritage designation, or some kind of development regulatory policy that overlays it. And so they may say that they're doing planning for all of downtown and they don't make Chinatown legible. They never name Chinatown once in the downtown redevelopment plan for Toronto or the growth plan for Ontario. And that's on purpose, we slip through the cracks. And so effectively what that means is Chinatown is perfectly in the gaps between all of these layers of policy that make it so that anyone could develop a property with the least amount of regulations than the status quo. Next slide, please. So here is just at a quick glance, the amount of development applications that are active in speculative activity from a center point on Spadina and Dundas. So this is just West Chinatown. This is a lot of transit-induced speculatory work. And a lot of it, again, is policy. Next slide, please. So I won't go too far into community land trust, but basically it's a way to take properties off of the real estate market forever in permanence to use for community benefit. This is an approach that many different groups have used over time, and Friends of Chinatown have decided to develop a unique approach from the typical community land trust that adds this additional framework of understanding how we actually retain community power and control of Chinatown that is embedded and grounded at the very bottom layer there in community organizing and collective care, not just reinventing the idea of how to hold properties and assets in the long term. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to announce and report that we are slated to incorporate in the coming Chinese New Year. We're looking forward to inviting you all to hear more about the updated research and property mapping and tenant surveys that we have done. And I'll end, next slide, please, by saying that you cannot introduce the idea of a land trust strategy without giving credit to the civil rights organizers who invented them. So it was a land-based strategy that came out of the United States in a very specific Black-led context, and that first community land trust that has existed still exists today. And so we learn a lot from that history in addition to the many generations of Chinatown organizing as well. Next slide. The other benefit we have is that Toronto has a huge wave of democratic land trusts that are also gaining control over their buildings. But the link back to Chinatown, next slide, is that Chinatowns have always had land trusts. So if you were to re-examine the historical mutual aid society, which is the benevolent associations, the family associations, we have always had groups of people who were not able to buy buildings individually, either because they were literally seen as illegal immigrants under the head tax regime, or otherwise come together and take out mortgages together and provide housing security for themselves. And so in that way, you could say that Chinatowns all already have community land trusts. And so we really don't need to reinvent the wheel here. This is truly my last slide. The next one. So I think the contribution that Friends of Chinatown wants to offer into this context is that when we say we are revitalizing Chinatown, nostalgic for Chinatown, fighting for Chinatown's heritage, it's our history, we want to offer this nuance that we cannot stop our strategies just to turning Chinatowns into museums or a tourist destination for the consumption of others, right? We're very concerned and terrified with the idea that the Chinese Canadian community uniquely is one that has such diversity within it that is capable of gentrifying itself. And so do we fundamentally believe that the meaning of Chinatowns is to be a marker of just Chinese Canadian history, or do we believe that they're actually a broader metaphor, a stand-in for that mutual aid resource that anyone who is marginalized by the colonial Canadian government can find their first accessible, culturally competent housing, employment, and social opportunities like our grandmothers did before us, right? Could we heal enough from our traumas as Chinese Canadians from being displaced from land to be able to offer this really radically expansive, incredibly inclusive understanding of what Chinatowns could be for, all of these strategies and mutual aid work that we have done over generations and are trying to preserve? Can we offer it to other communities that are suffering the same? So I think what we've learned is, especially through the land trust work, individual property ownership alone will not heal the trauma, but I think the dream is for us to be able to say, not that our grandparents had to suffer and struggle and were able to assimilate and succeed in their own way, that we would now turn to newcomers arriving today, that they should go through the same and earn their way through Canadian society. I would hope that our collective Chinatowns are generous enough to say that actually our grandparents should have never had to struggle through that in the first place. And so we will not stand for Chinatown to continue this type of harm. Once upon a time, we were seen as illegal and without status. So we would like to stand up for those who are that today. So my dream is for us to interrogate that, and what our role is forwarding land back, forwarding literal decolonization. And I think there are clues here. I think there are enough ingredients here for us to do that work. And I would like to do it with you all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And again, there's so many interesting parallels. And one of the key things that we had in our Chinatown was the city looking at Chinatown as, oh, nothing's happening economically. And so let's just upzone it to get development going. And so they were looking at 250-foot towers with minimum footprints of 250-foot street frontages, which would wipe out the existing Chinatown. Now, we've been lucky. The community fought back, huge fight back with the city, some really interesting public meetings. And so that zoning was pushed way down to only an 80-foot height and a maximum of 75-foot frontages. And one key developer right in my face at one of the public meetings, and he was yelling at me, and he says, "God damn it, we can't build anything in Chinatown now." And I said, well, that's the whole point, is to stop it so that we have a chance to just evolve. And I think that's one of the key things, is that we don't allow communities to evolve. We're always trying to push them forward with some other idea of what they should be. And so the land trust idea has been discussed in Chinatown. I know we've got a couple of guests that could probably speak to it in greater detail, but it's certainly a idea that has been talked about a lot for Vancouver as well. And then just one little note, just your note about that building, by the way, with the flashing lights is truly horrible. And talk about mean-spirited. That's just that was allowed. The flashing light bit is just astounding. But the interesting thing was the distinctiveness of the previous building. And in Vancouver's Chinatown, one of the interesting things was, up to a certain point, the community built its own architecture. And so that's the distinctive society buildings. But as soon as it became a historic area, and not because it was but it was for Sunday shopping, and there's a whole long story there, suddenly the city wrote guidelines, and suddenly they specified tile roofs, swoopy corners, lions out front, balconies, etc. And you can date the buildings from the 70s when the bylaw came in, overtly Chinese looking versus the original architecture. And that idea that Chinatown has to be almost dressed up is such a persistent thing all the way through the histories of these districts as well. So thank you. That was really, really interesting. And our last presentation is May from Montreal. And a couple of us have had a chance to chat with a few of the folks in Montreal early on around some of the issues. And it's always interesting to go back to Montreal, and I try to get back every year and just see what's happening with Chinatown. And so I'm really interested to hear what May has to say. So May, take it away.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so now I'm having trouble because I'm like a technological cave person.
Okay.
I have a slide presentation and I can't get you guys off my screen. Are you able to see what, like my PowerPoint, which is actually Karen Cho's PowerPoint?
We'll get Joyce to take this screen down.
So May, if you hit share screen.
Oh, okay. I hit share. Okay, share screen. Yeah. And then share again.
There you go.
Okay. Thank
There we
you. All right.
Excellent.
Man, it's hard to go last after such amazing presenters. On top of that, I'm just like a stand-in for Walter Tom, who couldn't present because of health problems. So first of all, I'm speaking from Montreal, also known as Jojage in the language of the Ganahaga people. Yes, like I said, this is actually Karen Cho's PowerPoint presentation I'm using, and I'm telling everybody that before I get accused of being a spy for plagiarizing other people's work. And what I'm going to do is briefly just present the work of the Chinatown Working Group. It actually folded its doors in September because it had done its work of quote unquote saving Chinatown. But I think that we can share the history of how we mobilized, because it was created like less than 2 years ago, and it did really intensive mobilization. And we obtained really good results. Of course, the work is always ongoing. Anyway, so this is one of the 4 gates of Chinatown in Montreal. And I'm told that actually Montreal has the most gates. We have 4. So apparently we have the most gates of all Chinatowns in North America. And you can see like right beside the gate. So now there's like almost the equivalent building on the left side of the gate. And so what happened was that in 2018, I'll go to the second slide, we had a press conference to, the community had lost cultural center, and the community, a community organization asked the Progressive Chinese of Quebec, that's the organization of which I'm a member of, to come and help them to lobby the city to help them to get it back. And so after the press conference, we noticed that there were these huge craters being dug right in the heart of Montreal's Chinatown. And nobody knew like, well, what is being built right in the middle of Chinatown? Like, and again, this is, the eternal history of having decisions dumped on us with no consultation and no information at all. So we figured out that, okay, they're like building like these luxury condos. So one of our members called the developer, pretending to be interested in buying a condo, and was told that, the starting price, well, maybe in Vancouver and Toronto, like this may not be a huge amount of money, but, for us in Quebec, we're told like, wow, $750,000 $750,000 for a 2-bedroom condo right in the middle of the city. Like for us, it's like so not meant for the community purchase. And so we launched a petition demanding that the municipal government develop a Chinatown development plan in consultation with the community. And we also asked for a moratorium because we didn't know how long, if we got the consultation, how long the process was going to take. And then at the end of the consultation, we all know about how governments buy time through these consultations or public hearings, and then shelving whatever recommendations come out of these recommendations. So we also asked for a moratorium. We were told by the same city administration that we have now that no, you can't have the moratorium because that's bad for economic development, but we will give you the community consultation. So that was started, and I have to say in good faith, they did an okay job making sure that the entire community was consulted, although again, they hired a non-Chinese organization to do the consultation, which knew nothing about our community. And it was the members of the Chinatown Working Group that sat on every single meeting, every single forum, expressed input in every single panel to make sure that the voices of the most marginalized members of the community were heard. And then we got hit, with the double pandemic of the COVID and anti-Asian hate. The double whammy of the COVID-19 and anti-Asian hate pandemics. And so, of course, it made the news. The things that Fred was showing on his PowerPoint, the same things happened in Montreal. And then, our progressive municipal government was on the hot seat to have to try to do something. And so we actually, ironically, we did benefit because out of this crisis, the government had this pants to the fire. And so they said, oh yeah, we are doing something. Look, we're doing this Chinatown consultation. And they gave funding for some promotional activities, to attract people to come back to Chinatown. And then in the middle of, the pandemic, these two pandemics, a third crisis occurred. I'm just going to go forward here. So what happened is that the most historic block in Chinatown, which we call the Wings Building, it dates back from the 1800s, and it was a block of buildings that had been used by many different communities before the Chinese community settled down and continued to use that block. It's called the Wings Building because the Wings Noodles Factory was the owner. And, again, in the middle of, the economic crisis brought on by the pandemic, they had, like a lot of Chinese businesses, they had so much trouble trying to even pay the maintenance fees that they were forced to sell. And, unfortunately, they sold to one of Montreal's biggest known renovation lords. It's a real estate developer called Schiller Kornbluth. And so they are just like I said, really infamous for buying up buildings with vulnerable tenants inside, and under the pretext of renovating, evicting everybody, then of course, doing some simple renovation work and then re-renting on the market for astronomical prices. And so the entire community mobilized to prevent the further destruction of the most historical block actually in Montreal, or one of the most historical blocks in Montreal. So that caught a lot of media attention. And actually, in this case, the city was proactive. They went, and even before any permits was asked for, they put a sign on the door saying no renovation or no renovations without permits or something like that. And so both the provincial and the municipal governments had to jump into action. They created what we call the tripartite committee. And it was a committee made up of members of the provincial government, the Ministry of Culture, which was responsible for heritage protection in Quebec, members of the municipal government, and then members from the community. And so fortunately, we had people with a lot of expertise in heritage protection, and some of them, Jessica Chen and Jonathan Cha, and Jonathan Cha was our the so-called community representative on this tripartite committee, and lo and behold, everything that we asked for was included in the recommendations when finally the tripartite committee finished this research and made its recommendations. So here I'm just going to go over some of the, these are just photos of some of the activities that we did. A lot of networking, a lot of a lot of informing our communities about what was happening in Chinatown. So anytime that there was a permit development, anytime there was a consultation, we would actually write down all the information in French, English, simplified Chinese, and traditional Chinese, and we would like do a lot of door-to-door leafleting in order to inform the residents about what was happening. So in the summer, yeah, well, these are just photos of like PR stuff for the city. I'm not going to go into that. And so, yeah, well, remember when I talked about the community consultation? So, yeah, last June, there was the community consultation resulted in what the city of Montreal calls a Chinatown action plan. So that was passed, and it was also, because of so much community involvement, the recommendations are quite comprehensive, and it touches on economic development, heritage protection, social housing, quality of life, green space issues. And then it also recommended the creation of a community platform, and that is where the Chinatown Roundtable was created. So I'm one of the co-coordinators of that. These are more efforts to mobilize. Yes, so you cannot see on your screen in November, we had municipal elections last year. And so for the first time in history, we organized an all candidates debate in Chinatown. And you can see how people were just really thirsting for politicians to come into Chinatown so that they can be held accountable and they can be asked questions. So that was a great success. And so these are photos of what happened this year in January, when finally we got heritage designation for like a main group of buildings, the Wings Noodle, we call it the Wings Noodles block. The central street that runs through Montreal's Chinatown, and then 2 of the 4 arches. Like why the other arches didn't get heritage protection, we don't know. But it's a really good start. And as G said, of course, just having heritage protection doesn't mean the battle is won. But for us, it was, like if the demolitions had continued in Chinatown, we would have had no space to organize around. And so we do consider that a huge victory. Yeah, so this is just a photo of the historic Wings building that we now received heritage protection from this province. And then the city of Montreal, their protection was to enlarge the area of Chinatown that would be recognized worthy of heritage designation. So basically, in a nutshell, that's what we've been doing for the past 2 years. Maybe I'll just add that during the summer, because, yeah, so just going back to the observation that receiving heritage designation affords a limited form of protection on Chinatown. So in the summer, in order to bolster the heritage protection, the city of Montreal convened public consultations on construction guidelines permitted in Chinatown. So they proposed to lower density and the heights of new constructions in Chinatown. So again, we just worked so hard to make sure that developers were not going to be outnumbering us in terms of, asking for lower heights and densities in Chinatown. And also so important because then it makes Chinatown that much less attractive to developers who think that they can just build like, 100, I don't know, whatever stories with, 100 condos, luxury condos for sale. So maybe I'll just end. I have no idea about how I'm pacing myself, but just a few words on future challenges. So yeah, we have the same challenges as the other presenters in terms of how to revitalize Chinatown from a decolonial perspective. so we do have, one of the most pressing issues that residents and merchants in Chinatown have been talking about right now. Jimmy Chan is listening, and so he knows that everybody is complaining about, like all these homeless people, and it's dirty, and this and that. People are doing drugs. They're selling sex on the streets. The thing is that in the heart of Chinatown, there is an Indigenous shelter. And so I think one of our future challenges is how to make Chinatown safe and secure for both housed and unhoused residents. One of the arguments that we have in terms of like promoting the value of Chinatown in Quebec is to say that we've always said Chinatown is very diverse, is inclusive. We're marginalized, and we live alongside other marginalized communities. And the fight against gentrification is to make sure that we don't just have what Walter Tom often calls like shiny new people and shiny new buildings. One of the main components of heritage protection right now is that we should treasure and protect both built and immaterial assets in Chinatown. And what we call immaterial assets are the traditions, the culture, the communities that live in Chinatown, whether they be, no matter what class or what vulnerabilities they have. And we're trying to, we do the land acknowledgements now regularly in all our public meetings, but how to move from words to action, and like even for me, even the concept of land trust, like how do we talk about the concept of land trust from a truly decolonial perspective, right outside of Montreal in Canada, Satagi, the municipal government or provincial governments just like named a large tract of land which the Indigenous peoples claim ownership to, but they said, oh, we're going to deem this to be worthy to be a national park, and so no construction can be there. And again, the Indigenous community are saying, what the heck? Like, you can't do that without consulting us. So even like how to even like approach land use and land trust from a decolonial perspective. And again, like I'm very encouraged that the Friends of Toronto have an anti-police position. The community in Chinatown is far, far, far from being there yet. There are lots of calls from Chinatown residents for more policing and also for more cameras everywhere. However, we're hoping that the community will continue to learn and evolve because unfortunately, 2 months ago, a Chinese man in mental distress was killed by the Montreal police. And again, community leaders like came out last weekend and marched in solidarity with the family, denouncing police profiling, racial profiling, and racism. It's been documented that the Montreal police, they disproportionately do ID checks against Indigenous women, Black men, and Muslim men. And so, like we do exist in this type of world, and how to move the community so that, that our actions are coherent with our vision and our values. That would be a major challenge. Maybe I'll just end by sharing with you that one positive thing that's going to happen next year is that we fought and won from the city a grant to do an economic research. And I think for sure in Montreal, it's going to be the first of its kind. But remember in the Chinatown Action Plan, we had, one of the priorities was economic development. So without consulting us again, the city announced to us like, hey, good news. We gave $60,000 to a marketing research to see, how to best stimulate the economy in Chinatown. And, it's like, and it's, it's like a standard marketing research that does not look at all at the context of anti-Asian hate, health pandemics, wars, inflation, and worst of all, the climate crisis. And we cannot do business as usual anymore when we're talking about an approach to revitalize Chinatown. And so we said, hey, number one, you didn't consult with us, and number two, how will this research help us face the future challenges on how to revitalize Chinatown when tourism can be shut down, when there's gentrification going on, when we're losing our legacy businesses. And like, by the way, the last few years of pandemics that hit our Chinatown, it's not the first time that we've been going through all these crises. We survived head tax and exclusion act, and we've survived so many decades of xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. So maybe you can also ask your researchers to look into how the lessons, the strategies that our ancestors used, and maybe we could learn something going forwards. And so we got the funding. So the research is expected to be published by next spring, and so we'll be really happy to share that with you. So that's it.
Thank you. That fantastic. It's extraordinary how there are so many similarities and striking differences between all of the Chinatowns. And certainly in terms of Montreal, when Jessica Chen got in touch a couple of years ago, was always quite surprised that Montreal's Chinatown wasn't actually recognized as a historic district, had no sort of protection. I always assumed, having visited there with 4 gates, that there must have been some acknowledgement, but not. And so it's fantastic work over the, I think, what would be a relatively short period of time of advocacy of what has been achieved. We are running a little over time here, but I'm going to stretch everyone's patience ever so slightly. We have a couple of questions in the chat, which 2 of them could take up another hour just trying to answer. And as much as I would love to dive into that deeply, what I would like to ask, though, is just a summation, I think, from everyone, because the issues are similar and different, and we're all working within, I think, each Chinatown that has its challenges. And I know when May was talking about cities commissioning reports and then letting you know that, oh yeah, we've commissioned this, that kind of happens. Or what we get is boatloads of reports about all sorts of stuff that should happen, and then they go sit on the bookshelf. And when you go to a meeting and you say, well, laneway activation is one of our things that we're trying to get, the secondary street aspect of lanes and things, and we've commissioned 2 separate reports and a UBC study on how to do that. And you go to a meeting specifically with city staff on laneway activation, and the first words out of the planner's mouth was, we can't do that. And it's like, but you commissioned the reports. Yeah, but the issues are too difficult, we can't do it. And then that was the end of the meeting, really. We talked for another hour, but it was pointless. And I've often been struck by how much has been written, studied, and then it just sits and there's no action. And so I'm intrigued again that we have a lot of advocacy here that is achieving certain things. So what I'd like to end on is just a summation from everyone. And I know it's broad, and I apologize, but what does the future look like? Is it, oh my God, we're in for so much work still, or we're making headway? I know it's not rainbows and unicorns, but what does the future look like for each of your Chinatowns? And so what we'll do is we'll go east to west this time, and we'll start with Montreal. May, what do you think?
Oh, sorry. I was reading the chats. Could you just repeat the question?
That's all right. There's some really good stuff in the chat too. And we'll try and capture all of the comments from the chat, and we'll put it up on our website. And by the way, the recording too, we'll make it available so that folks can watch this afterwards as well. But May, just what do you think? Future looking good, right? Lots more work.
You know, I just find I think that we're running out of time. I've always got one foot in the climate crisis, you know, climate change movement. Actually, Montreal, like Montreal's Chinatown is kind of like barricaded now because the COP15 is going to be happening in about a week. Yeah, like, you know, it's caused havoc in Chinatown because with like a huge police presence everywhere. So, you know, I think that I'm optimistic in terms of where our movement is at. We're really lucky that we have a municipal government that cares about its reputation. And so we are really on a good collaborative terms, although there's never enough resources. We're like very, like Teresa was saying, we're always like really badly under-resourced. But you know, if I look at the larger context of things, like on the one hand, yes, we're doing good work in terms of like saving Chinatown, but then on the other hand, you know, the killing of Ronnie K 2 months ago, there's still like a huge silence with respect to getting any types of accountability. And I'm not joking, like the arrest of Mr. Wang Yuesheng, you know, it brought on a comment by our provincial Ministry of Economic and Innovations. And another xenophobic comment by saying things like, "Oh yeah, I wasn't surprised by his arrest. We know how the Chinese are." So I think it's going to be a struggle because xenophobia and anti-Asian racism is always going to be the huge stick that's being held over our heads. So like that gives me like continual cause for concern. And I just think that we're running out of time to build inter-community solidarity, which she was saying, you know, solidarity with the Muslim communities and the Black community and the indigenous communities. Like, I just feel like we have so little time, and it takes time for us to prove that we are worthy of, that we are honest in our outreach and our ability to provide mutual support. And you know, sometimes people don't trust us, like in the indigenous communities, you know, we have to like prove to them that we are worthy to earn their trust.
No, I agree. I'm going to jump over Toronto briefly because Teresa has to leave shortly. So Teresa, I'll hand it off to you for a summation.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Chi, for accommodating. Try to be succinct here, 4 points. I think from a Calgary perspective, we are feeling the situation is promising in terms of the progression, the development, you know, in a way riding on the current wave of EDI, you know, now is anti-racism. But then, you know, as someone who have gone through this for the third round, you know, there's always a question at the back of my head is how long would this last? And so I go back to my point about the need to build capacity and accountability. After the previous 2 rounds, how can we actually be better at holding our public entities accountable, and not let this talk promises dissipate. So I want to reinforce that. You know, promising, but and I'm also feeling optimistic, but then I'm an optimist, that with these kind of dialogue that we're having a little bit more often, I'm seeing that opportunity for us to share and learn from each other and gain a greater understanding on the unique, our common and unique challenges, especially speaking from a prairie perspective. We don't have the critical mass here in the prairie. We don't have the kind of coalition that have been built. We don't have those things. So I think it's important for us to gain that those understanding. But at the same time, I think this kind of dialogue is also showing that the beauty of working as community is we have different people addressing different aspects of the issues, and because I think to resolve a social phenomenon like saving Chinatowns requires different kinds of intervention. So I'm fascinated by what happened in Montreal. I learned a lot from Vancouver. I'm fascinated by what she is doing. So I think that having this kind of dialogue is making me feel also optimistic. Lastly, I 23, the centenary for the Chinese Exclusion Act, I think would be a year that for reflection, a year of opportunity to talk about Chinese Canadian needs and issues of the past and the current and the future. So I hope that Chinatown would be part of that discourse and dialogue in the year to come.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Chi, your thoughts?
Because of the chat and because some of the back and forth, I feel the need to offer a further nuance to how it's possible to hold an anti-police stance within the Chinese Canadian community. I think, a lot of folks who have memories of Chinatown stores being disproportionately raided by the police for licenses, the laundry businesses that used to be harassed all the time. At some point it shifted. At some point it really did shift our community conversation about it. And I think it is actually possible to dream of a day where we do not need to rely on externalized community safety by a service like the police and actually be able to build it on our own. But at the same time, for example, with the security cameras in Chinatown, Friends of Chinatown Toronto would not take a stance to, demonize any individual business owner that chooses to have security cameras for their store, or chooses, because there is a lack of community alternatives, instead of calling their neighbor, to call the police if a very severe situation were to happen. There is nuance there, right? It is possible, because if we as a group cannot offer them an alternative from the police, then why would we put such a restrictive kind of attitude towards them? So it's both and at the same time, even though if it seems contradictory. And actually that very nuance is what gives me hope for what's happening, at least in our Chinatown. It feels like we're able to work in a community political perspective that is truly diverse, from many different lived experiences and many different waves of immigration. Toronto's Chinatown is deeply multilingual. The Vietnamese diaspora is very represented here, Cambodian, Southeast Asian of all sorts. And so there's an understanding that once upon a time the word China didn't really mean anything besides that you were vaguely Asian. So there were Japanese folks who were also called Chinamen, right? And so in that way, we want to extend back our vision for what actually constitutes Chinatown into this incredibly strong multicultural community base, and that's looking up. But I can't help but also feel really defeated, like May, because of policy announcements that are happening in Ontario right now. Almost all of the development protections and concessions that we have fought on a site-by-site basis so hard for are being wholesale repealed in Ontario, and that has already gone live. There's a bill called Bill 23 that we have fought and lost the opportunity to fight. And it's unclear whether that bill is worse for farms, food, wetlands, housing, poor people, tenants. It might as well, it's called the Build More Homes Faster Act, but it might as well be called the Developer's Christmas Wish List or the Evict Tenants Faster Act. So both optimistic in the community sense, but deeply pessimistic in the policy sense.
Well, Chinatowns are never not complicated, so that's true. And it's interesting too, because our newly minted premier is looking at ways to increase housing supply and loosening up certain rules. And we haven't seen any firm things yet, but yes, it's interesting to watch how some of those initiatives have negative impacts or potential negative impacts as you move forward. And then to wrap up, Fred, do you have a few words?
Yeah, as said by many of the speakers, you know, even if you got destination as historic area, and all these buildings are designated as historic buildings, but that does not guarantee from upzoning. Developers always want to upzone so they can make more money.
Mhm.
What happens is that, you know, we went in Vancouver, we went through many fights in upzoning, in particular, you know, 105 Kiefer. And if we're not continue to be vigilant, we'll see, you know, upzoning, not just, you know, the heritage buildings, but also other buildings as well. You know, you mentioned before, John, that, you know, one wants to build a 45-story building right next to Millennium Gate. So these are things that we have to be vigilant.
Yeah.
To conclude, I would like to mention that next year, the museum will be opening. The exhibit will be based on Chinese Exclusion Act and identity papers.
Yeah.
I'd like to invite everyone to visit the museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Yes, and that's going to be an extraordinarily good exhibition that one of our board members is the curator on. I just like to say thank you to everyone for such a fantastic morning here, afternoon elsewhere. I hope everyone has sort of picked up some ideas, but also just the challenges and the similarities across the country. And I think we should probably do this again sometime. This was quite fascinating. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out of your day for this. I've learned a lot out of this. And I think this was a really fitting way to do one of our annual Lynn lectures. So on behalf of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society, thank you so much. We will preserve the chat. We will have this recording up on our website somewhere. So we'll send out a notice to participants. And let's keep in touch. But thank you so much, everyone.